Now, my talk is about the law. It's not about volunteers who have been making these remarkable efforts to make the underwater archaeology work. And so, if you will excuse me for that, I'm going to deal with the law, and it's not been an easy one, but there it is. The Protection of Wrecks Act in 1973 was brought into being because there was no legislative recognition before then that such sites existed, so they couldn't be protected. And yet there was growing mayhem on some sites in the sea involving treasure hunters and well-meaning amateur divers. And tensions grew when archaeologists like me became involved and civil servants had to administer inappropriate laws and conflicting aims. What follows here is very much my point of view, having been involved from the beginning. However, others were very much involved too on this and other matters, most especially in the creation of the Nautical Archaeology Society. Now, I'd like to mention Alex Flinder, Paul Johnson, David Blackman, Ray Sutcliffe, in addition to those I'm going to refer to. I described the difficulties that needs involving historic shipwrecks in an article and in Antiquity 1972. This was on the eve of the creation of the Wrecks Act of 1973. And there was real mayhem at that time. And I briefly explained how the Act came into being in another article in the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology in 1986. You'll see those, that's the Antiquity article and beginning of it, and that's the origin of the Council for Nautical Archaeology, which is a lot of it's about the beginning of the Protection of Wrecks Act. Now, the Act was created following the old Council for Nautical Archaeology's campaign for a law to protect historic wrecks. And in 1969, the wreck of the Dutch East Indiaman, Amsterdam, sunk in 1749 in the beach of Hastings in East Sussex, was attacked by treasure hunters. And I saw these appalling photographs, which you will see here. The men were working for William Press Limited, which was not responsible for the actions of their men, and used mechanical excavators on the wreck while building a sewer outfall nearby at low tide. This was all completely legal. In the wreck, they found bronze guns, bottles of wine, and many other historic things. This is the mainmast of the ship, which had fallen to the side, and for some reason I could never understand, a man in a mechanical excavator pulled it up and it broke in the sand. There's another one which revealed not only the upper deck at the lower part of the photograph, but also the lower half of an upper deck gun port. So there was a huge amount of the ship surviving. And there were bottles of wine. This is just one of them, and you can see it's lit from underneath, and you can see the red wine inside the bottle. And that gentleman with spectacles on the right-hand side of the photograph is the curator of Hastings Museum, who was completely at a loss as to what to do with this whole matter. Anyway, this was immediately seized on by the Council for Nautical Archaeology, which was created in 1964, as illustrating the need for historic wrecks to be recognised as a class of monument, since existing British ancient monuments legislation did not include them. Now, and to understand this, you have to understand what the legal status then was believed for ships, and therefore their wrecks, and that they were chattels, that is, movable possessions, so weren't included in existing legislation. A ship, however big, had no more status than a cup which you've got your tea or coffee in. Anyway, this was tested when I requested it after 1963 that a Roman barge that I had excavated or partly excavated on land at Guy's Hospital in London be scheduled under ancient monuments law. and was told by government lawyers that only fixed structures could be protected. Had the barge been tied to a mooring post, the post, a fixed structure, could be protected with an area around it that included the barge. Alas, there was no post. That vase of samian ware on the right-hand side was found with the Roman barge. In 1969, I was approached by lawyers representing William Press. This is the Ancient Monuments Act which we were dealing with. In 1969, I was approached by lawyers representing William Press Limited and archaeologically investigated the Amsterdam wreck with a huge involvement from others. And we found that the ship was 2/3 complete, having sunk into the mud, and was the most intact vessel of that type known in the world and represented the beginnings of global trade. This situation, it is still the best preserved East Indiaman known in the world. The Council for Nautical Archaeology wanted to highlight this as a visible example of the vulnerable legal situation of this class of historic monument that could not be protected under existing ancient monuments law. Other important historic wrecks, such as the Mary Rose of 1545, cannot be seen. So focusing on the Amsterdam, which could be seen, was ideal, and it was visible at low spring tides. So we needed to demonstrate to Parliament that historic wrecks were a class of monument that had no recognition or protection, and therefore there was a very burning need for such a law. So in December 1969, I published an article in the Daily Telegraph magazine. This is the survey of the remains of the ship, and the arrow, by the way, shows the height to which the side of the ship had survived, the upper deck gun ports. So I published there an article in the Daily Telegraph magazine featuring the Amsterdam. That was in December 1969. And this was followed in January 1970 when a Times newspaper photographer saw the wreck at low tide and featured it in some of with some of the finds. So this was what happened. So there was interest from Fleet Street, and we needed that publicity to inform Parliament and MPs. So major events happened in March 1970 when Angela Croom, another hero of all this Protection of Wrecks Act, invited national newspapers to photograph the Amsterdam at low tide one morning. And I arranged for JCB Limited to supply a high-level platform from which photographs could be taken. This resulted in great publicity in newspapers over the next days, with photographs of the wreck and finds. So this was the morning in March when the sun came up, and I was amazed at the number of people from Fleet Street who came down, the photographers, and because I'd never really seen anything quite like this before. And these are the newspaper reports that came out. Absolutely amazing to find. And we even had in the evening news in London a cartoon which really was the cream of the top of the publicity cake. Well, at the same time, questions were asked in Parliament, and this was arranged by Angela Croom and Valerie Fenwick, asking Ian Sprout, MP, to request the Minister for Trade and Industry for a law to protect historic wrecks. And we had demonstrated that a law was needed, particularly, and it became particularly urgent when in April 1970, a man hired a I don't know who he is still, a man hired a mechanical excavator and dug into the stern of the Amsterdam. You can see a newspaper article in the Times on the right-hand side. And there's nothing we could do to stop that. Anybody could go in there and bring up guns and bottles of wine and sell them in auctions, and it was all perfectly legal. Anyway, the minister agreed, and a committee was established, of which I was a member, to draft the proposed legislation. In November 1971, the Under Secretary of State for Trade and Industry announced in Parliament that the department was considering the introduction of short-term emergency legislation, which became the Protection of Wrecks Act 1973. Emergency in this case, I suppose, is typical of government, but it took 3 years. Subsequently, that was the Act. Subsequently, the administration of the Act was passed to the Department for Transport, and 50 years on, it's still being used, but by the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, that's DCMS, to protect historic wreck sites. However, the Protection of Wrecks Act 1972 was only a partial answer and was intended only to be interim, since it did not include the protection of the remains of wrecks on land, now on land as at Guy's Hospital, or for surviving historic ships, such as HMS Victory and the Cutty-Sark, or for submerged land sites. So when the Ancient Monuments Act was being updated, Valerie Fennick and I saw Professor Grimes at the Institute of Archaeology, London University, who was on its advisory committee. We asked him if wrecks at sea and on land might be included in what became the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act of 1979. Thankfully, this was done, and the Roman barge at Guy's Hospital was scheduled. And this became important because later Guy's Hospital ran out of space for its buildings and decided to wanted to erect a cancer wing on the site of the Roman barge. And Historic England, or English Heritage as it was, had done a wonderful job in ensuring that the Roman barge is not damaged by the building of this construction of this building. That wouldn't have happened had this not been protected. So the creation of the Protection of Wrecks Act of 1973 was important at its time, for it gave much needed recognition to this type of monument. But it had a limited remit, as it was only intended to be temporary legislation. It was not intended to be used 50 years later. Though for 44 years, the government has been using both the Protection of Wrecks Act 1973 and the Ancient Monuments Act of 1979 to protect historic wrecks. And I do wonder why. The Ancient Monuments Act of 1979 is important, as it adds to historic wrecks in the sea, those that are on land, as an important step forward, accommodating these sites into the care of the rest of the archaeological monuments that are protected in Britain, things like Stonehenge. It is better than the Protection of Wrecks Act, and although it needs adjustment, there is therefore, in my view, no need for the 73 Act anymore. So that's the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act of 79. Now, the protection, and moreover, the Ministry of Defence has since created the Protection of Military Remains Act of 1986, whereby protection can be given to wrecks of both world wars that are war graves. Those of World War I are over a century old, and the British government has agreed to treat them as historically important under a UNESCO convention. But what types of wreck need clarifying? For the Ministry of Defence claim that it's only applied to sunken warships seemed very odd. And I didn't agree that only warships should be protected. So 7 of us, with much needed help from others, such as Douglas McElvogue, who will be speaking tomorrow, and cost of public money, confronted the Ministry of Defence at judicial review in the High Court, where we won. This is an underwater photograph taken by Doug of the ship, and you see at the bottom the picture of the ship before she sank, and we won. That's the publicity that resulted. So we've now got three acts which protect historic wrecks. As before, we had focused on one merchant ship, Storer, that was torpedoed in 1943 and 21 men had died in her. Sunken merchant ships of both world wars qualified for protection. Those of World War I are of historic value under an UNESCO convention. So should DCMS be involved in these war grave wrecks, particularly those of the First World War? This is an issue which needs addressing. So where are we now? In this year of 2023, we have an administrative muddle. There are three laws and the UNESCO Convention to protect historic wrecks. We have 4 government departments which own historic wrecks, and they don't talk to one another. We have at least 14 government-based bodies which are directly involved with historic wrecks. So, in my view, a review is needed that simplifies the whole legal and administrative process relating to maritime archaeology. Historic wrecks are part of this, but there is more, such as the care of submerged land sites. Meanwhile, the Joint Nautical Archaeology Policy Committee, nobly chaired by Bob York, who we'll be seeing later this morning, now deals with the many complications that arise from the lack of a coordinated approach by government departments and other bodies to maritime archaeology. In 1973, nautical archaeology was the Cinderella of British archaeology, unrecognised and unwanted. 50 years later, thanks to the Protection of Wrecks Act, wrecks are recognised as a type of historic monument. They are still waiting outside the home of archaeology, but they're still treated as something different. Nautical archaeology in its widest form is still waiting to join the care of our international heritage. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Peter. You can turn on your camera. We'll be able to see you. Thank you. And I know you did have input from Valerie for going back to those early days of lobbying. But and I think Valerie's here. Is Valerie with us today? Yes, she is. So hello to Valerie, and thank you for all of the efforts that you both undertook to get us the Protection of Wrecks Act back in the 1970s. Do feel free to ask Peter any questions. We're going to be following up Peter's session or Peter's presentation with the discussion about the Protection of Wrecks Act, and Peter's going to be joining that as well. So I think that some of it's going to get dealt with a bit more, I'm sure, when Bob asks you some of your opinions. And in fact, Dave Parham tomorrow morning is also going to be looking at the potential for the future, about what change or what the future of wreck protection should look like or might look like. Can I ask, can I kick off with a question about this William Press Limited? You were approached by lawyers of William Press Limited. Who were William Press Limited?
It was a major contractor at the time, and they were building a sewer outfall. And somebody had read a local history book which had in the appendix a photograph of the Amsterdam and contemporary letters that described the wreck of the ship. And they saw it at low tide because they were building the sewer outfall right by the ship. And they used their machines at low tide when they weren't working to dig in. And
I see.
That's what happened.
So yeah, it's not that the outfall was actually going to go over the wreck side at all. It was actually to one side, but because they were there, and could they see the wreck, or was it just, as in, do you know if it was exposed as it is sometimes now?
Yeah, they could see the wreck when the tide is very low. The month is spring tide, so you can see it in outline there. And I must confess that at the time, a sewer outfall lay just to one side of the wreck. So when there were pools of water in the wreck at low tide, there were all sorts of horrible things floating around that we had to deal with. Well, just try and ignore and record the remains. But yeah, but they were washed away as the tide came up. But it was William Press did this work, and I was quite horrified when I saw the photographs of what was happening. And it was, if anything, those photographs drove me and the others to really push for a law which recognized these wrecks and gave them some sort of protection.
We have comments and questions coming in. One from David Blackman, who I'm sure you were a long-term friend of association with. He says Peter has not mentioned the wreck of the Association, which the CNA also highlighted, and he thinks that he's wondering. I think this is more of a question. He thinks that maybe you, Valerie, and he are the only survivors of the CNA from 1964.
I think that's probably true. Yes, it's a great pity that so many people have died, but there it is. And he's totally right. I talked about mayhem, and the article I wrote in Antiquity listed huge problems. One of them was that on the Association, which was wrecked in, I think, 1707 in the Isles of Scilly, there were rival diving groups went down on that wreck, and they were finding silver coins. One of the groups was a man called Roland Morris, who David will remember, and he was a local restaurateur in Penzance, and on one occasion, one of the groups was setting off explosives on the seabed, while other divers from another group were down on the wreck. And it's a wonder nobody was killed. But there it is. It was
described as the Wild West, I think, in the film yesterday, wasn't it?
It was absolutely awful, the things that were happening. So we just desperately needed, I could come up, and I know David could come up with all sorts of examples of what was going on. But what was important was that the Amsterdam was visible, whereas the Mary Rose, the Association, and the others were underwater and couldn't be seen except by divers.
Do you think it's likely then that without the Amsterdam circumstance, that actually convincing ministers that there was a need when things were underwater would have actually failed, would have fallen on deaf ears?
Oh, I wouldn't like to answer that one. But certainly the Amsterdam was really important. And what you're saying may be true. Because we just needed that. And the old Council for Nautical Archaeology have been going for some years, and tried to pull together what was going on. And we all knew among ourselves what was going on, but trying to get the interest of Parliament, that wasn't the case. That we needed something very visible.
Yeah.
And the Amsterdam sadly was very damaged by these mechanical excavators and these men, but it was central to our request that a law be created.
I think there's something in that invisible side of things. If you look at the way in which the general public and then councillors and then ministers and then obviously the devolved government in Wales got behind the Newport ship, a very visible ship in their town, and wanting to make something of that and protect it rather than just simply allowing the development to go ahead with the minimal amount of investigation. And if you compare that with underwater sites, which are needing the same level of public support, it's difficult to get to grasp the general public in that way when they can't stand over it and look down and watch the bits of it being revealed and be part of that exciting discovery process.
Now, I'd like to add that while all this was going on, there was a parallel campaign going on, which I was central to, and that was getting the Dutch to understand this and to know about the Amsterdam, and that led to a lot of Dutch people wanting to bring the Amsterdam back to Holland, like the Vasa in Stockholm or the Mary Rose in Portsmouth, and for her to be displayed in Amsterdam. But that is a huge cost.
Yeah.
And that's a totally different story. But a lot was going on about that as well. So it wasn't just simply the Protection of Wrecks Act. It was also what to do with the Amsterdam.
Of course. There's questions and comments coming through. There's a very broad question which Nick has raised, which actually I'm going to say it, but I think we should probably leave the answer to that to the panel discussion session a bit later on, which is, how would you see the confusion being resolved? Everything perhaps being brought together under a new act. But let's not answer that now, because I think that's probably going to become part of the panel discussion next, chaired by Bob. We also had a question about the maximum punitive sanctions about fines, prison sentences for breaking the 1973 Act. But you'll be pleased to know that Terry from Historic England has answered that question for you. So,
oh, good, because I don't know the answer.
It's in the chat. A person guilty of an offence under Section 1 or Section 2 above shall be liable on summary conviction to a fine or of not more than £400, or on conviction or indictment to a fine, and proceedings for such an offence may be taken, and the offence may be for incidental purposes being treated as having been committed in any place in the United Kingdom where he or she presumably is for the time being. Anyway, so there's the answer has been put in the chat for people that want to know what the sanctions, what the punitive sanctions can be. But we have a question about planes, in fact, Peter, and maybe you know about this as well in terms of the protection for sunken aircraft.
In Goodwin's, yeah.
Well, anywhere really around the UK waters, in terms of which act deals with that.
Which act? It's the Protecting Military Remains Act of 1986. Is wartime crashed planes. Yeah. So I know we're going to talk about it later, but I rather than come up with answers, I just feel that very much that a review of the whole situation is needed, and how the extent of involvement of DCMS, because there are problems with the MOD, there are problems with the Protection of Wrecks Act, there are even problems with the 1979 Archaeological Areas Act. The whole lot has grown like Topsy and uncoordinated. And there is an involvement of all sorts of other bodies. I mentioned 14. There are more than that. But, for example, the bottles of wine from the wreck of the Amsterdam, when they were brought ashore, suddenly and unexpectedly, I was confronted by customs excise, because they said that this was wine coming into the country now, and it needed to be be taxed. I had to queue up with the lorry drivers at New Haven Port with a customs entry form for bottles of wine from the Amsterdam that's been wrecked in the 18th century. It was crazy, but there it is. And that's not resolved.
Really, still not resolved.
And now we're out of the common market. If an excavation takes place, then of the Amsterdam, there are going to be many more bottles of wine found. And who's going to deal with custom excise?
Of course, no one's got any intention of drinking it. So.
and if the wreck is taken back to Holland, it involves it needs a license, which comes out to the Arts Council.
Yeah,
the whole thing just needs,
because of exporting an antiquity or antiquities, hundreds or thousands of them.
The whole lot needs to be put on the table and brought to a sensible conclusion, which looks at it all and puts nautical archaeology, brings it in fully into the whole gamut of British archaeology, and not be treated as something different.
Alison James from MSDS, who's been dealing with the Rosevike, has just said it certainly does need a license. They've just dealt with that with the multiple licenses, and she described it as a bit of a nightmare! Exclamation mark.
Yeah.
We've David Johnston with the hazardous protected wreck site has said in 1991 convictions on the hazardous site, £125 with £275 of costs for each of the 4 divers that were that broke the Protection of Wrecks Act legislation. So that was in 91. So I don't know with inflation what that would be now, but that's pretty sizable fine, I suspect, to recreational divers. Maybe to salvage companies it's not. And then we had a question about wartime wrecks, for example, in French waters. Are they similarly protected? I don't know how much you know about French protective regime.
No, I seem to think that the French government is much harder on ownership and control.
Yes, well, they've ratified the convention, haven't they? UNESCO convention, and I do know that licenses to dive on even Second World War sites have to be applied for in French because representatives learning from Martin and Alison at South Sea Sub-Aqua Club are having to get a friend of theirs who can help translate for the submission of the license applications. Okay, I think we're going to leave it there so that we've got plenty of time for the quiz before our next session.